Welcome to Transformation at CIIS. Listen and be transformed. Welcome to Transformation at CIIS. I am here today with Dr.NickWalker. Welcome, Nick. I am so glad that you're with us. We are going to be talking about your book, Neuroqueer Heresies. And just before we jump into that conversation, I want to read a few sentences about you. You share that you are a queer, transgender, flamingly autistic author and educator, best known for your book, Neuroqueer Heresies, and your foundational work on the neurodiversity paradigm and Neuroqueer Theory. You also write speculative fiction, including the urban fantasy webcomic Weird Luck. And you are a professor of psychology at the California Institute of Integral Studies, where we all work. And this is how we were connected initially. You're also the managing editor of the worker-owned indie publishing house, Autonomous Press, and a senior Aikido, hopefully I said that correctly, instructor at the Aiki Art Center in Berkeley. Welcome again, Nick.
Thank you.
So great to have you here. Can you tell us, did I miss anything in that bio? Is there anything else that you want us to know about you?
Oh, that was a fine intro. I am a longtime member of the CIIS community. I'll say that, right now I am core faculty in both the somatic psychology program and the undergrad psychology program. But I worked as an adjunct faculty member before those core faculty positions, and I'm a graduate of the Transformative Studies program here at CIIS and the Somatic Psychology program and the Interdisciplinary Studies program. So I've been really immersed in the CIIS community as faculty and a student for, I guess, since about 2006.
Wow. You are a veteran. A member of our community. I'm so grateful that you made the time to talk to me.
Well, likewise, thank you for having me here, for coming.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I want to say something, and I want to start our conversation, sharing something that I thought might be of interest to the community. We at the Division of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, we are working on getting things right. We are working on sharing information and being a part of the community that really exemplifies what diversity, equity, and inclusion would look like and feel like. And still, sometimes we get it wrong. And sometimes we don't know everything. And I wanted to just open with that because you and I had a conversation coming into this where I thought, oh, this is great. We're going to talk to Nick. Nick is an expert on autism. So we'll take this conversation and we'll, use it, leverage it as part of Autism Awareness Month. And you, gently corrected me and shared a perspective on Autism Awareness Month that I didn't know or understand. And I wanted to start with that. First of all, just to lay the groundwork for the learning that we're going to do today. But can you share with me that perspective on, because I thought it was so helpful to hear that, and it ties so nicely into your book, into the different paradigms that we have. And there's definitely the medical model. There's definitely the pathologizing of some experiences. And I felt very strongly that you were trying to coach me in that direction in that email.
Yes, yeah. So there is, there's this dynamic around autism and the societal discourse around autism, the cultural discourse that we're all steeped in, that follows a pattern similar to the patterns that have occurred around other oppressed groups. And so if you look at, historically, you know, now if we have, you know, a class on at CIIS, you know, we have wonderful classes on Black psychology at CIIS right now. And if you look back 100 years ago to, you know, a time where racism was being addressed, far less, when you wanted to study, you know, in anything academic about the Black experience, you'd find all these classes taught by white professors, and you study textbooks written by white anthropologists looking down on Black people. And, you know, there'd be nothing from a Black point of view in the curriculum. And of course, that shifted massively for the better over the years, and still needs to shift even more. And then the same thing sort of happened around, you know, gay rights. All the discourse in psychology was, you know, hetero psychologists writing about homosexuality as a disorder that needed to be treated, and how can we treat it? And that's and of course that's also shifted enormously. And you're not going to come to a psych class at CIIS and here's how we cure a gay client of being gay. But around autism, that discourse is just in the early stages of starting to shift. And the majority view is still very much autistic people are talked about rather than being allowed to speak for themselves. And there's actually a great deal of writing and scholarship by autistic rights activists and members of the autistic community, and by autistic scholars like myself. There's a great deal of writing and knowledge out there, but it's largely ignored in most of academia and most of the professional world. And in public discourse as well, it's autistic people being spoken about by non-autistic people and pathologized, with autism being framed as a mental disorder or a tragic disease that dehumanizes people, in much the same way that being gay was talked about even during, you know, my lifetime. Even when I was a kid, you know, people could be institutionalized for being gay. And so so part of that is, you know, we have you know, Autism Awareness Month in April, and autistic community on the whole just dreads this month, and the autistic-phobic propaganda they're inevitably exposed to over the course of the month. Because Autism Awareness Month, what's it about? You know, it's really about large organizations run by and for non-autistic people that are about presenting our very existence as a tragedy. But the goal is to end the existence of autistic people. And when you get, you know, all the money that's raised by Autism Speaks and raised in Autism Awareness Month through promoting this this tragedy narrative of autism and how terrible it is. It's all about non-autistic people and what a terrible burden it is for non-autistic people that people like me exist, and what a tragedy it is for parents to be burdened with an autistic child. And all of this narrative is about promoting this alarmist tragedy narrative in order to scam people out of their money. The money goes, I mean, to pay six-figure salaries to the people who run Autism Speaks, and it goes to advertising budget to continue the money-making scam at autistic people's expense. None of it goes to benefit autistic people. In terms of services for autistic people, what we get is extremely abusive, trauma-inducing conversion therapy designed to force autistic children to imitate non-autistic children. And most of the money actually goes to eugenics research and finding genetic sources for autism to prevent people like me from being born. So when you support Autism Awareness Month, that's what you support. Mm. When you like put out material about autism and it's got a puzzle piece as an autism symbol, that's an Autism Speak symbol, and other symbol used by a lot of anti-autistic groups. That's a symbol that says autistic people are not humans, we're a puzzle to be solved. So all of that stuff that, that's again, it's very, you and I hadn't had that conversation. It's like CIIS might have, a very well-intentioned school like CIIS with a sincere commitment to diversity might have gone ahead and put out, Autism Awareness Month materials and really sort of made CIIS a much more hostile and traumatic environment for its autistic community members.
Yeah, and I mean, it's so fascinating to me how we get to a place where an organization like that has become so prominent, and yet it may be causing harm, from what you're sharing. And even recently, I saw someone with a friend of mine with an Autism Speaks t-shirt. And to your point about kind of the fundraising mechanism and the awareness raising, I think that they have championed, they've done the job of getting a word out there about their, I suppose, their perspective on autism. But what I love about this conversation is your perspective, and creating the space, the work that you're doing, creating the space to challenge that. Because it sounds like what happens so often is that a dominant narrative gets created and so many people run with it, but it takes away from the actual core kind of the reason we're here. And the reason that I would imagine that we're here is to really learn from those most proximate, right? The people like yourself who know more and live this experience in a way that I think for me certainly has helped me understand, where to align and where to have this conversation. So, with that, I really did want to explore the pathology paradigm that you talk about in your book versus the neurodivergent paradigm that you talk about in your book. Because, the thing is, as a society, I think we have been programmed into the pathology paradigm. And, even I shared when we talked briefly about my history with seizures. And as someone who lived for close to 2 decades with seizures, I mean, I saw myself, I felt pathologized. I felt that there was something wrong, right? And in your book, you talk so like, for me, it gave me ease. You talk in such a loving way about, shifting that paradigm, because inside that experience is a human being, right? Having those experiences. And it made me think about how ableist our society is. Yes. And just how focused we are on what this thing called a norm, which is not existent. So could you talk a little bit about the pathology paradigm versus the neurodiversity paradigm?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, so this is sort of a foundation in my work, kind of where I started from in terms of my the work I've been doing over the past, I don't know, 15 years or so. And so, so we have this idea of, neurodiversity. Neurodiversity is a phenomenon. It's a biological fact. We're a neurodiverse species. Humanity is neurodiverse the same way that we're ethnically diverse and we're culturally diverse and we're all different sizes. And so it's one of those forms of human diversity. And when we talk about neurodiversity, we mean the diversity of minds and styles of neurocognitive functioning. How does the mind function, and really how does the body-mind function? And the body, the mind as entwined with not just the brain, but the whole nervous system and the way the whole body works together, the way that our senses inform our cognitive development and vice versa, the way that our movement shapes our consciousness and vice versa. And so there's this whole sort of way that human nervous systems function, and the whole gestalt of what is our embodied cognitive experience in the world and way of being and way of processing the field of information into a reality, and thus, way of communicating and interacting with others, with the world. And so this is neurodiversity, the fact that everyone is actually different in this regard, in terms of exactly how they function neurocognitively. Everyone's sensory experience and cognitive experience and embodiment differs in various ways. And so, what I observed, what I described or articulated, and sort of as in the early part of my work on neurodiversity, is this idea that there's a dominant societal paradigm around human neurodiversity, a lens through which society as a whole tends to view neurodiversity. And that lens is what I call the pathology paradigm. And the pathology paradigm, the basic premises are that there's some kind of normal mind, that there's a normal way for a human mind to function. And if you are significantly outside of whatever your culture considers the normal range, then there's something wrong with you. You have a disorder or a condition, and you're lesser in some way. And the goal becomes, well, how do we cure you? How do we fix you? And so what's been emerging really since the early days of the autistic rights movement in the 1990s is what I eventually named the neurodiversity paradigm. So this term neurodiversity developed within the autistic community in the 90s, and I didn't come up with it, but I came up with this term neurodiversity paradigm to describe what I saw as an emerging paradigm, an emerging framework, and an emerging perspective that challenged the pathology paradigm. And the neurodiversity paradigm rejects the idea that there's one normal mind. It says the idea of a normal mind is like saying that there's one normal race or one normal gender or one normal culture. And plainly, every time someone has said that, and every time you hear someone saying, there's one right natural ethnicity or one right natural culture, you know that you're looking at someone who's about to start oppressing people and committing atrocities, and you know that it's bad news when someone's like, there's one right natural normal way to be. And the same thing is true around neurocognitive functioning, that there's no normal mind. All there is normative standards or socially constructed standards of normativity that change over time and vary from culture to culture and historical period to historical period. And and so the neurodiversity paradigm partly is about, rejecting this idea of a normal mind and saying we need to embrace human neurodiversity, the full spectrum of human neurodiversity, the way we ideally embrace the full spectrum of, racial and ethnic diversity and cultural diversity and gender diversity. And also notice that the same sort of hierarchies get built. That, like, for instance, the way that autism is pathologized within the field of psychology is similar in many ways to the way that being queer has historically been pathologized. The way that autistic people are spoken over, and that there's so much professional and academic and public discourse about autistic people that doesn't include our viewpoints really mirrors the oppression of so many other groups throughout history. And also the diversity of any kind, cultural diversity, ethnic diversity, gender diversity. When you do embrace these forms of diversity and stop setting up hierarchies of privilege and oppression, you get an increased creative synergy. You get this capacity for people to learn from each other and learn from having different perspectives. And the same is very much true of neurodiversity, that if you make space for a wildly diverse spectrum of neurocognitive styles, you get people learning from each other and how to adapt to each other, and you get so many different perspectives on a given problem, and you start to kind of increase the intelligence of the community and by drawing on the genius of diversity.
Yeah, thank you. And I mean, so much of what there's so much there in what you said, but what's coming up for me is I wonder what that looks like in the classroom. We're at an institution, we're at a university. I'm imagining that for every faculty member with a classroom filled with students, you're going to have diversity of all kinds, and you're going to have that student or students show up. Potentially every student is neurodivergent. Potentially each person has very different needs, right? But what would you say to faculty members who are encountering that and may not know exactly how to approach that? Because I think in my seat, I hear a lot from students, and I hear a lot of concerns from students. And so I wonder, especially in your seat, like, what is your advice or wisdom for faculty members who might be not sure how to support all their students?
I would say, for one thing, be aware of it. Be aware that this is an issue that you're going to have, that you probably have a neurodiverse classroom. You're going to have neurominority students in your class, and you're going to have just different modes of cognition going on in the class. And like navigating any other form of diversity in a classroom, be aware of your own positionality and the fact that there's a lot of experience you don't know about, and so make an effort to let it be known. You're open to learning. You want to hear from the students about what they need and what's going on with them and such. It's the same, in a sense, it's the same as navigating any other form of diversity. And there are faculty, in the broader academic community who have a hard time with that. There's faculty who are freaking out now about, like, students insisting, gender nonconforming students insisting that faculty get their pronouns right. And, oh my God, this is an imposition on my academic freedom to have to actually pay attention to someone's pronouns and to something outside of heteronormative binary gender. And, there's always that, like, faculty, academic faculty who've been teaching the same viewpoint, whose textbooks are racist or homophobic, and who really don't want to hear about it. They have to make some change and do some learning and growth themselves. But it is actually an ethical responsibility we have as academic faculty to do that learning and to keep doing better and expand our own perspectives and make sure that we're not furthering systems of oppression. And that can mean, learning from our students, learning from our colleagues, learning from our students. So really, in terms of making the shift to the neurodiversity paradigm, it works the same way. And have that dialogue, have the dialogue going with students. Let it be known that you want to hear about. Well, how do you learn? How do you think? How can we work with this academically, where we're in an environment where how we think very much matters, where what are we doing here in academia? We're immersed in the world of knowledge. And so the fact that different people in the classroom have very different ways of processing knowledge is a relevant factor to pay attention to. And I think that part of that is an expansion where historically we've had this idea historically, okay, there's one right academic language, there's one right way to express everything. And it's this very dry thing that's like inherited from, 18th and 19th century Oxford and Cambridge scholars and such, and really has very little bearing on the way that discourse and thought is done these days. And we've become more flexible. I've certainly seen more flexibility around that at CIIS. You want to have certain academic conventions observed, like you do citations, so you're not plagiarizing, and giving credit where credit is due through citations and that sort of thing. And you need, your work to be coherent and readable. And everybody needs to work continually on how can I better and more coherently express my ideas. All of that is fairly universal in the academic environment. But in terms of language and approach to knowledge and approach to learning and writing, there's a lot of variety. And CIIS, I think, excels at that in many ways, because we do have these, commitments, the 7 commitments at CIIS, which explicitly includes that we honor multiple ways of knowing and multiple ways of learning. And so in a sense, developing a more neurodiversity friendly academic environment is really about honoring that commitment that we've already stated we have. And that can mean a lot of interesting things in terms of how writing is done. Like, have we considered being open to papers that, as long as they're coherent, that maybe come at ideas in very different ways, where we really are open to this idea of allowing students to write in a way that expresses how they think, or movement also is, we're not a school that does huge lecture halls. We're not like, 400 people seated in a lecture hall listening to a teacher lecture while they watch a slideshow. That's not us. We're usually, we're sitting in circles, we're having conversations. And I think there's room for the fact that different people, with different nervous systems have different modes of embodiment they need to do to be themselves and to learn. So I make space for that too in classrooms. You gotta, if you need to be moving around, like, okay, find a space in the classroom where you're not too much of a distraction for the other students, but like move, change your position, do what you need to do with your embodiment to, in order to most effectively cognitively process what's going on and what we're learning. So yeah, I think all of those things are crucial. There's also another aspect to accommodation, though, which is just looking at the curriculum. And how do we not create a hostile environment? Because again, I think CIIS is attentive to that. I mean, we're in academia, and academia is in, I think, the early stages of coming to terms with, the fact that we are, academia as a broader institution, not just CIIS, but academia on the whole, and all the fields of professional practice like psychotherapy and such that are informed by academic training. Academia has such an extensive history of being complicit in racism, sexism, homophobia, in all the societal systems of oppression, structures of oppression. Academia has very frequently served to reinforce these things. And so, sexism and racism and homophobia, have all at various points in academic history been passed off as objective science, for instance, and ingrained deeply into textbooks and into what students are taught. And that is still very much the case in most schools, I would say. And I see CIIS making a really sincere effort to change that. And I think, if when someone points out that something at CIIS, that something in a textbook is racist in its assumptions, or sexist or homophobic or transphobic in its assumptions, that's taken seriously. And I know that my faculty colleagues take that seriously and will revise their curricula accordingly. Say, okay, well, let's have a critical discussion of this, and and then maybe, I'll take it out of the curriculum next semester entirely, or I'll keep it in the curriculum, but frame it as like, let's take a long, hard critical look at this and see what's wrong with it here. So, and that's good work. And I do think CIIS tends to be a leader in that, compared to some, more conservative institutions that are really trying to hang on to their role in these oppressive structures and really don't want to update the curriculum. But we really need to update that curriculum around neurodiversity in general, and around autism in particular. I really see to some extent, the school is still very much a hostile environment for autistic students. And I hear from them because they don't even want to talk to a non-autistic faculty member about it, or, but it's distressing, autistic students and faculty are distressed. And I see students trained in a way where they'll go out into the world and perpetuate harm against the autistic community because they're receiving bad information about autism. Just like, 50 years ago, it was routine for students in an institution that trained psychologists to be trained in homophobic information, and then they would go forth and perpetuate harm against the queer community because that's how they'd been trained. That's what they'd taken this homophobic information in as if it were objective science, because that's how it was presented to them. And so right now, there's a lot of bad information about autism in the curriculum, and students contact me and about it. And it's like, I'm really hoping that we can start making a shift in that, start making a shift in awareness on the part of faculty, and really looking at what we're teaching students about, about autistic people.
Yes. Again, there's so much that you said in there to process and unpack, but, it made me think about the essay that you have and was included in your book about throwing away the master's tools. And, the thing that I think about that is, as I came to understand Audre Lorde's essay about the master's tools, it felt to me like a challenge for me to always be examining myself and where I was complicit and where I may have some things wrong, right? And so when I read that particular part in your book, that's what kind of reached out to me, is this idea that we all have a role in not moving forward in a world that allows for the harm to continue. And so when you mention, students reaching out to you, like I've had students reach out to me about different things, I am automatically like, what can we do to support students? How can we as individuals not enable these systems? What is it that, helps us put down the master's tools in this particular area of work?
Yes, well said. Yes, absolutely. And I think it really is, I teach a course in the undergrad psych program here at CIIS called Intro to Neurodiversity Studies. And I actually now partly wrote my book to use as a textbook in that course, because it's, like, okay, what do I think that people need to know as an introduction to these topics? And so at least in that one program, students are getting that knowledge, and it's really striking teaching the class how transformative it is for the students, because they really had not been exposed to any of this information. They had been exposed to so much bad information, so much really toxic and destructive information about autism. And so it's, it's really important to me to see, I think, we have an ethical responsibility to really take a look at what the curriculum is around autism. What are we teaching around it? And it's, and so much of it is terrible, and so much of it has been debunked, by recent autistic scholarship and recent research. And it's really just research like, when much the way that racism used to be presented in standard academic texts as if it were objective scientific research, or sexism or homophobia, all the stuff that was just bigotry, but it was disguised as objective science. And people would do research studies that would start out with these prejudices baked into the assumptions behind the research. And so that would bias the results. And so the same thing is very much the case with what's in the curriculum around autism right now, with the stuff that's like standard knowledge and standard in the literature and professional training is actually bigotry masquerading as science. And so updating that is really important, and the work to challenge it exists. The critiques by autistic scholars exists, and the evidence of the challenges, the bigotry that's baked into the dominant narrative exists. It's just about making the faculty aware of it and really being diligent about that. And I'm concerned, one of the reasons I'm so glad we're having this conversation is because it is a concern of mine that I haven't seen a lot of interest, that I'm a leading autistic scholar. I was the first one to, articulate this sort of the premises of the neurodiversity paradigm. I'm very widely cited in all the work that's challenging the pathology paradigm and challenging this anti-autistic bigotry that's based into the dominant academic narrative. And especially since the publication of my book, what's happening is I'm getting invited to talk to faculty at a bunch of, a lot of schools. Like I'm talking in a few weeks to the School of Education at Johns Hopkins, which is a very reputable school. And yet that's not happening at CIIS. That's troubling me. It's troubling me that for the most part, my faculty colleagues at CIIS so far are not reaching out to me as a resource and saying, hey, can you check on, my curriculum on autism and make sure I'm not just teaching people something that's going to be harmful and further prejudices. And the fact that I'm getting reached out to by very reputable schools like Johns Hopkins are not getting reached out to within the CIIS community by faculty. Like I want to find a way to change that, and that, that seems like a crucial step here. Like, hey, I'm right here. The CIIS is my favorite school. It's where I choose to be. I really want to do that work here and not just in other schools.
Yeah, and I mean, you're such a valuable resource. Just reading the book, looking at your website, but looking around in the world, I can see, where you really have created a path, like opened a way for this conversation, along with some other experts. But I mean, to me, even thinking about some of the language that I encountered, but that I know that you are, I don't want to say fully responsible for, partially, like, I feel like that is such an opportunity for us at CIIS to pull you in, to ask you to be thought partner with us. So if there's anything that I can do to make that happen, and hopefully just having this conversation will be a first step, but I would love to know that our faculty are tapping you as a resource. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm just so glad, I mean, your division, you're right, just having this conversation is a crucial first step. And, you and Rachel Bryan, have taken, your whole division now is, of the school is taking an active interest in this. And I think that's a really important and really crucial first step. And so, yeah, I'm hoping that it leads to more. And I know that, now you can reach out to me and use me as a resource whenever, anytime. So
I definitely will. There's one last thing on my mind, and that is the language of pathology versus the language of diversity. And it's on my mind because we're having this conversation about the classroom, about students, about the ways that we speak and talk. And I'm wondering, are there things, because there's so much, and I love the term neurocosmopolitan, for example, because that opened it up for me as something to pull into my own vocabulary. But I'm wondering if there are things within those two, the language of pathology or the language of diversity, that are important, that you want to be sure that, faculty in particular, but as we interact with each other, just as human beings, that there's language that we need to embrace, or that you would encourage us to embrace over language that we've, been socialized around, that might be, have the pathology.
Right. Yes. I think a really big one is a person first versus identity first language. And that's a keystone one, I would say, that in the dominant narrative, the narrative of the pathology paradigm, autistic people are not called autistic people, we're called people with autism, or people with a diagnosis of autism, people with a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder, or people on the autism spectrum, anything to avoid saying autistic people, like autistic is a dirty word. And that's very much the language of pathology, because we don't say, people with blackness, or people with homosexuality. We used to, when homosexuality was pathologized, when it was in the DSM, it was like people suffering from homosexual paraphilia, so that was very much the language of bigotry and oppression and stigma and pathology. And this person first language, people with autism, was developed by non-autistic people, and particularly by people who were founding anti-autistic hate groups and pathologizing autistic people, was developed largely actually by parents of autistic children who hated that their children were autistic. And it was developed very much over the objections of autistic people. And as autistic people have been pushing back against it and saying, please call us autistic people, that's what we find respectful. We've been pushing back against it for 30 years now. and still, you know, it's commonplace in the academic environment, including CIIS, for people to say people with autism and think that that's acceptable and even think that it's respectful. But of course, it's not any more respectful in calling gay people people with homosexuality. It's actively disrespectful because it implies that autism is some kind of condition that we have, that, you know, we say people with cancer because it's, you know, it's a disease. It's something that people don't want. People would rather have their cancer removed. And so talking about autistic people as people with autism is stigmatizing and implies that, like, we're somehow separate from this, rather than, no, it's actually intrinsic to how we experience the world. It runs at least as deep as something like gender, for instance, if not deeper, because gender is fluid, whereas if you're autistic, you're autistic. So it's, you know, it's deeply intrinsically a part of us, and how our minds and self-experiences and embodiment develop. You know, it's not a condition that can be separated from us. And the language is actively harmful. It's not just that it's disrespectful or that we find it inaccurate, but it's actually harmful because it promotes this idea that autism is a condition that can be cured or fixed or some way. And that promotes these harmful conversion therapies, like attempts to cure or treat autism, which inevitably are harmful and trauma-inducing, and you know, particularly behaviorism. You know, there's this terrible behaviorist technique called applied behavioral analysis, or ABA, that is widely inflicted on autistic children now, and actually has the same origins as gay conversion therapy. And it's designed to force autistic children to behave as if they're non-autistic, so that their parents can feel like they have a non-autistic child. And it is enormously trauma-inducing. There's increasing evidence, you know, studies being done showing linking ABA to lifelong PTSD. But it's that term, people with autism, is almost like a marketing tool for so-called therapies like that, because it promotes this idea that the autism is something that can and should be removed from the person, as if there was like a non-autistic person underneath the autism. But there's not. There's just us. We're autistic, you know. So so using the identity first, you know, autistic people, calling autistic people autistic, not being afraid to say the A word and not hiding behind euphemisms, that's huge. That makes a huge difference. And when someone calls me autistic, when someone says autistic, when they're talking about autistic people, you know, in the classroom, right then it's like, oh, there's a little relaxation that happens inside me. Like, okay, I guess maybe this is a safe environment for me. You know, maybe like, yes, people actually are speaking respectfully of me and acknowledging me as an autistic human being. So like, yeah, so that's one piece of language that makes a giant difference.
Thank you, Nick. I mean, this is so helpful and insightful for me, and I will carry this conversation and, you know, the language, but also the awareness with me in my work. But the one thing I still wonder is there anything I missed? Is there anything that you want to share with the community and the people who will be watching this that hasn't been covered in our conversation so far?
I mean, again, I'm, you know, here to be a resource, and I'm just really grateful to you and the whole division for having this conversation. I feel like I should hold up a copy of my book here. Yeah, I feel like I should, like, here we go. Yeah, I love this cover here. So, yeah, so Neuroqueer Heresies is the book. And yeah, I just want to highly recommend it. I mean, it's a little self-serving to recommend my book to, but really it's like, I just put a line here that I think is essential to changing the narrative and really had, to a large extent, had CIIS students and faculty in mind, because this community is so important to me. And I was really thinking, you know, I'm going to assign this book. Other people might assign this book. Like, I want, what do I really want to say to people? What do I think it's important for people to know? So yeah, so I am going to just shamelessly hold up the book and be like, yes, Neuroqueer Heresies. I wrote it for you, CIIS community.
Yes, you did. And I'm so glad you held it up. I have an electronic copy of the book, and I've been reading it, and I think it has transformed me and my perspective. And so I know it'll do the same thing for others. I also know that, you know, the fact that you wrote the book because you noticed that there was a void in the literature and in the academy around this is exactly what we need. We need, you know, the people to answer the call when we see the void. And I think you did that with this book for sure. So thank you for being with us today.
Thank you so much, Damali. Thank you so much for having this conversation.
Thank you, Nick. Listen and be transformed. Listen and be transformed. Listen and be transformed.